Welcome back to Close Up. The end of May marked 3 years since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota by a police officer who knelt on Floyd's neck in a restraint position for almost 10 minutes. A video recording of that incident touched off protests, civil unrest, and calls for change. Here in New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu responded by creating the Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency. It made several recommendations, some of which have been incorporated into police training and state law. A key figure on that commission and in New Hampshire law enforcement is Assistant Commissioner of Safety Eddie Edwards, who is our guest this morning on Close Up. Thanks for being here, Commissioner.
Thanks for having me.
So for starters, Commissioner Edwards, having played such an integral role in the process of the response to what happened to George Floyd, you were one of the first people I think we called after that video became public, and you spoke eloquently to the inhumanity of that situation and how horrifying it was. But you were also making a point almost right off the bat of how unnecessary that was from a police tactical standpoint. Just revisit that moment for us.
Yeah, I think if we reflect back on that moment, it was horrifying. It was horrifying to watch a human being being pinned down to the ground on his neck and begging for mercy and not receiving it from law enforcement, from a profession that I love, and I know what type of training I've received over my years, the type of training I provided to other law enforcement officers. It was horrifying, and I think he was robbed of his humanity at that moment. And since then, I think a lot of things have happened across our country. There's still challenges across the country. But here in New Hampshire, I think we've done a fantastic job. You mentioned the governor's initiative, LEAC, brought together perspectives from across our state, different voices to the table. And we did that in response to make sure that we knew what we were doing here in New Hampshire, that we examined some of our practices here in New Hampshire, not because we were forced into doing it. I think the governor showed great leadership when he brought LEAC together. And I think the members who participated on that commission were very proud of the work product that we came forward with from LEAC, the 48 recommendations.
Yeah, where do you think things stand now from your perspective in law enforcement and as a black man, 3 years later on the progress that's been made?
Well, when I look at what's happening in our nation in law enforcement still, I think there's still many challenges. And I don't say this to say that we're perfect here in New Hampshire by any stretch, but I do say that we can serve as a model for the rest of the country, because we took a hard look at what we were doing, and we brought forth some remarkable changes in our training here in New Hampshire and accountability in here in New Hampshire. And so, two things. I think as a black individual who has served in law enforcement for more than 30 years, that has given me a lot. It's given me a lot. But law enforcement takes a lot from you, Adam. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned since George Floyd. The law enforcement, there's a lot of demands. And so if you think about law enforcement from this perspective, we're taking a member of our community, putting them in uniform, asking them to do some extraordinary things, asking them to see, experience those things on an ongoing basis repetitively. And we haven't always been there for law enforcement, for mental health, substance use disorders. And those are some of the things that we're certainly doing in the Department of Safety. I'm seeing those things being done by other police departments across our state. Those things are very important because we want to make sure that we're taking care of the men and women we're asking to do something very extraordinary. And I think they're meeting that challenge. I think we're meeting that challenge here in New Hampshire. That doesn't mean that we won't hold people accountable. We're going to hold people accountable when there's police misconduct. We're certainly going to do that. We're going to enforce the law. We're going to hold people accountable when they commit crimes. And I think you can do both of those things. And that's what we've experienced here in New Hampshire. And we've had a couple of programs, and I hate to call these programs, because when I think about ABLE, which is the active bystanders in law enforcement, and I think about procedural justice, these initiatives, programs, have become a part of who we are, what we do. And I think they have served the state. They're starting to serve us well. They're starting to serve us well.
You mentioned the ABLE program. That's essentially a peer-to-peer training that helps officers intervene with each other when they see something that's going wrong. That is, like, if you apply that to the George Floyd situation, you have other officers who were there, had a superior officer engaging in the killing, but the other officers didn't intervene. How hard is it to try and break that chain of command? Because that seems like that was part of the problem here. How do you work around that when they see something that is going wrong?
Well, what we tell new recruits, I actually teach one of the programs over at Police Standards and Training, and I have to really give a lot of credit to Director John Skipper at the Police Academy. He's doing a fantastic job of training our new recruits and providing in-service training. But I actually teach one of the programs, procedural justice, and in that program we talk about ABLE training, and we talk about their responsibility We're empowering young officers when they come out of the academy. You have not only a responsibility, you have an obligation to stand up and say something and intervene, because only a police officer can stop a police officer in that moment. There's an expectation that that's going to happen. There's an expectation across our state that when a police officer is engaged in that type of behavior, that they're stopped. And one of our captains in the state police, Brendan Davey, made a statement, which I agree with wholeheartedly. Let's make sure that we're intervening so that their worst moment doesn't become the defining moment as a police officer. Because, again, we're asking people to do something very difficult. Very difficult. Doesn't mean that that's in the absence of accountability.
We talk about community discussions and the ongoing importance of keeping that discussion going, but there's also the people who are there too. How important is recruiting in this, and making sure that police forces reflect the communities they serve in?
Well, I think you can't say enough about recruitment, right? Because part of the recruitment is that we want to make sure we hire good people. And what does that mean? That means that people have integrity. And integrity doesn't mean that you're free of mistakes, that you won't make a mistake, but that you're honest about your mistakes, that you own what you've done or haven't done. That's integrity. We can train you to do the rest of it. So we look for people there first. Then it is important for people in different communities to see people who reflect them in their communities. That's unmistakably a quality that we look for, but that's not the only quality we look for, because we have to make sure that we're bringing on the right people who can do the job. You and I don't have to look alike. We don't have to come from the same communities for me to be respectful to you, for me to treat you as a professional. And so whether you're white, black, male or female, gay or straight, we want to make sure that if you're serving in a uniform, you're serving people and you're giving them professional conduct that they deserve.
Everyone has these high standards of getting things done and achieving change. A lot has actually changed too. You have body cams now for state police.
Yeah.
How important is data in terms of making sure that the accountability side of things is there from the LEAC perspective?
I think when we looked at LEAC, that was one of the things that we talked heavily about. The community really wanted data collection. And we have different components of data collection. One of the things we've done at the Department of Safety, for instance, is that we changed our website to make it easier for people to find data about their communities, specifically about their communities. But collecting data remains one of our ongoing efforts, because it's important. It's important for us. It gives us an opportunity to focus our training. It gives us an opportunity to provide a window of what's going on to policymakers, for people in the community. And so data collection is very, very important. And I think it's something that the community expects for us to do. I know that we've engaged our community stakeholders. They've been happy with some of the efforts we made in data collection, but they would like to see more, and we're going to keep working towards that.
All right, Assistant Commissioner of Safety Eddie Edwards, we appreciate your perspective as always.
Thank you, Adam.
All right.